The wind screamed through the naked cliffs, carrying grains of sand and ice crystals far into the vast expanse of the Central Asian steppe. In this godforsaken land, where summer is fleeting and winter inspires a chilling dread, a small Pallas's cat was born in a narrow fissure between the rocks. His mother, anticipating his arrival, had sought out a secluded haven to shield herself from the ever-watchful eyes of predatory birds and the biting winds. Rocky ledges and sparse shrubs were all that separated the newborn kittens from the dangers of the outside world. Her thick fur provided a warm sanctuary for her young, allowing them to first glimpse the world in relative safety. She instinctively knew that every rustle, every sigh, could betray their location to enemies, and so she began to teach her offspring the paramount skill for their harsh world: to remain unseen. No one could know how many kittens first saw the light of day that day, for Pallas's cats are creatures of profound secrecy. Amongst the litter, one kitten stood apart, imbued with a spirit slightly bolder than the rest. From his earliest moments, he showed no fear in peeking out from beneath his mother's fluffy flank, listening intently to the distant howl of the wind. And when his eyes finally opened, granting him the ability to discern vague outlines, he greedily absorbed the stark beauty of the perilous landscape. Rugged mountains, like grim titans, rose on the horizon, and the cold, endless steppe seemed to stretch to the very edge of the sky. This tiny kitten had no inkling of the trials fate had in store for him, nor how profoundly his life would be altered by the intrusion of beings who had no place in this solitary world. First hunt an acquaintance with the steppe. Time passed, and the kittens grew. The mother Pallas's cat, a seasoned hunter, began to instruct them in the art of stalking pikas, marmots, and other small rodents, the staple diet of these steppe felines. The Pallas's cat is renowned for its incredibly dense, long fur, capable of retaining warmth even in the harshest frosts. Its legs are short, giving its movements a somewhat stocky but exceptionally sure-footed gait. The kittens were still clumsy novices at hunting, but their mother gradually introduced them to the harsh reality that prey is not simply given. One must creep low to the ground, ensuring the wind doesn't carry scent, and strike with sudden ferocity when the victim least expects it. The bold kitten, who stood out from his siblings, experienced the thrill of the hunt for the first time when his mother brought back a still living rodent, releasing it for her offspring to use as training material. Though the rodent was petrified, a flicker of hope for escape still burned within it, adding a sharp edge to the scene. The little Pallas's cat, hissing softly and flattening his ears, pounced on his first prey. His heart pounded as he felt the warm body of the rodent beneath his paws. And though the act might seem brutal, this was nature's way of teaching the kitten the skills of survival. This first victory was his initiation into another world, one demanding caution, agility, and speed. Dangers under the open sky. As autumn deepened, the steppe slowly transformed. The brief summer, the only respite from the harsh climate, was drawing to a close. Lead gray clouds gathered on the edge of the sky, bringing the first rains and then the snows. The mother led her kittens further afield, showing them hidden spots where they could take refuge during blizzards and teaching them to distinguish familiar scents from those of enemies. In this land, beyond natural predators like foxes or wolves, lurked a far more insidious threat: hawks, falcons, and eagle owls, capable of snatching an unwary Pallas's cat in an instant. The little fluffy hero learned on the fly. At the mere shadow fleeting across the sky, the entire brood would flatten themselves against the ground, holding their breath, striving to become one with the landscape. Thick fur, mottled coloring, and the ability to move silently were key advantages passed down through generations of Pallas's cats. Yet, not everything depended on skill. In such a severe world, any mistake could be fatal. Each day with their mother was invaluable. She demonstrated how to find food beneath stones, how to camouflage themselves against rocky outcrops. And although the kittens had not yet faced open conflict, they understood. Sooner or later, harsh reality would force them to test their own courage. Ominous forebodings and whispers of the night. At night, the frigid wind snaked into the small crevices where the palace's cat family sought refuge from prying eyes. The moon illuminated the thin layer of snow, rendering the whiteness blinding. The little hero awoke with an inner disquiet. An unusual silence hung in the air. Normally, at this hour, pikas would squeak, conversing in the night wind, and other step sounds would fill the nocturnal darkness with life. But now, everything seemed to have hushed, and only a distant rustle somewhere down the slope hinted that living creatures still roamed these vast expanses. The kitten cautiously poked his muzzle outside and saw two lights gliding through the night. These were not the eyes of a predator. Rather, they resembled the glow of torches or lanterns, yet the kitten could not comprehend what they were. His mother was not nearby. Likely she had gone hunting or was patrolling the vicinity. Fear pierced his small heart, but curiosity won out. He took a few steps on the crisp snow and his ears pricked up as an unfamiliar scent reached him. It was a smell unlike any beast he knew. It reeked of alien power and menace. The kitten froze, and in the darkness, his fur began to ripple gently in the wind. For the first time in his life, a human being entered the canvas of his nocturnal world, the poacher's trap. When the mother returned, an air of alarm permeated her movements. She had heard footsteps, and guided by the scent she picked up, she determined that humans were close by. Palace's cats learned from the tragic experiences of their kind. She knew not all humans were the same. There were those who sought to understand and preserve wild animals, but there were others best avoided. The family decided to wait out the night, trying not to betray their presence. However, by morning, as twilight dissipated, it became clear. The newcomers had not come in peace. Just a few dozen yards from their den, traps had been set, bait scattered. Clearly poachers' snares, instruments that had stolen the lives of countless animals across these lands. The mother kept a strict watch, ensuring the kittens did not stray far and fall into the danger zone. But fate, at times, plays cruel tricks. The boldest and most inquisitive kitten, succumbing to his spirit of exploration, followed the trail of the bait scent. His head swam with a mixture of terror and curiosity. He moved in bursts, acutely aware that he must not leave tracks and must not let his nose lead him into a trap. But then, the small, still not entirely agile creature slipped on a thin crust of ice. 2 heartbeats, and a snap echoed, chilling to the bone. Metal teeth clamped shut around a small paw, and his world turned upside down. Pain and despair. Overwhelmed by pain, the kitten yelped, but his cries were instantly swallowed by the silent step. His mother heard the faint call, and the instinct of a protector surged within her. She faltered for a moment, realizing there was nothing she could do. The trap was a human invention, impossible to break with a simple bite. The most important thing was not to fall into a similar snare herself. However, compassion and maternal devotion trumped fear. Sliding across the snow, she moved towards her young one, carefully skirting the set traps. The little hero thrashed wildly, tearing his paw against the metal teeth. Blood stained the white snow crimson. In that moment, perhaps for the first time, he felt acutely how fragile and vulnerable a palace's cat's life could be. Until this moment, the world, though dangerous, had seemed lawful. There was hunting, there were natural enemies, there were forces of nature. But now, as he felt the cold steel on his flesh, it was as if he saw clearly. Man had brought a new dimension of fear and pain. He clawed at the air with increasing desperation, trying to free himself, until he felt his strength almost completely ebb away. Suspicious footsteps in the snow. Just as the mother reached the trap, heavy footsteps and muffled voices reached her ears. The poachers were returning to check their snares. A large figure in a warm wool coat and squeaky boots was approaching closer and closer. Palace's cats understand the language of movement better than words. The mother knew if she stayed here with the kitten, she risked not only her offspring's life, but her own. She could, of course, try to attack, but she was clearly outmatched by a human in strength, and he most likely had a weapon. It became clear, if she fled, abandoning the kitten, he was doomed. If she tried to defend him, both would perish. And in this hopeless situation, the mother's heart made the most desperate choice, at any cost, to distract the poachers and lead them away, so that the kitten would have at least a sliver of a chance. Resolved, the mother Pallas's cat took several quick steps across the snow, leaving visible tracks, and allowed the man to spot her. She hissed ferociously, puffed up her tail, and instantly darted towards the crevices, as if signaling, "Look, prey, chase me." The man did indeed notice her, and shouted something loudly to his companion. Boots crunched in the snow, and the mother led them further, away from the trap, hoping that fate would not be too cruel and that someone or something would help her kitten later. Fading hope. The kitten lay in the trap, weakened by pain and blood loss. His consciousness flickered between reality and oblivion. The cold wind chilled him to the bone, and his thick fur, which had once provided protection, now only gathered blood on his paw, staining the kitten's muzzle as he tried to lick the wound. His small heart began to fail as shock and fear drained his strength. The world around him narrowed to a white patch of snow and grey rocks. Time crawled agonizingly slowly. He no longer saw people and heard no footsteps. Images of his mother, sisters, the first rays of sun warming their small nest flashed before his eyes. The Pallas's cat's heart, still young but already overflowing with terror, beat in time with rare twitches. Perhaps he was destined to become just another nameless victim of human cruelty, an unexpected witness. But nature is a vast, diverse organism, and not everything within it is indifferent to suffering. High in the sky, a bald eagle circled, scanning for potential prey. He noticed a motionless patch with a reddish tinge below. He descended slightly, but Pallas's cats are too large for an eagle, and the raptor sensed that the prey was not in his weight class, and the strange smell of metal and blood put him on alert. The bird disappeared, dissolving into the piercing blue. But a weasel, passing nearby, showed a different kind of interest in the situation. These quick predators are sometimes rivals to Pallas's cats in hunting, but it was unlikely a weasel could help the kitten. She simply slipped away somewhere into a crevice, carrying her sly curiosity further down the slope. Thus, endless minutes of solitude ticked by. The kitten's strength was failing. No one was nearby to help, and his mother, perhaps she herself, had fallen into trouble. Everything indicated that the little one would not survive the night. But fate decreed otherwise. Encounter with a kindred spirit. Early in the morning, as the first rays of sun began to disperse the frosty mist, a young researcher passed through these parts. She worked at the local nature reserve, studying the region's ecosystem. She was searching for tracks of snow leopards, dreaming of seeing even a couple of paw prints in the fresh snow. She had often heard about cases of poaching and knew how dangerous set traps could be. Trying to avoid suspicious areas, she suddenly noticed spots of blood. Her heart sank. Someone had clearly been injured here. Following the bloody trail, the girl stumbled upon the trap, in which lay a barely alive Pallas's cat kitten. His fluffy fur was iced over, and his paw was horribly clamped and injured. He was no longer moving. His eyes were closed, only a faint wheeze indicated that life still flickered within him. Grabbing a small stick, she carefully loosened the trap's clamp and, not without difficulty, freed the paw. The kitten hissed pitifully as the cold air touched the wound, but he no longer had the strength to resist. The researcher examined him and realized that she needed to act fast. If she didn't treat the wound and warm the little creature, he would perish. Precious moments of rescue. Her heart ached. She knew that in such situations with wild animals, it was important not to cause further harm. Pallas's cats are extremely secretive and distrustful creatures, and contact with humans is a profound stress for them. But there was no choice. Either she would take him in her arms and try to provide help, or leave him to die. There was no hesitation. She had to save him. She took a small towel from her backpack, carefully wrapped the kitten so as not to directly touch his claws and teeth, and pressed him to her chest. The warmth of her body transferred to the animal, giving him a chance to warm up. The wind carried frosty freshness, and the snow crunched under the girl's feet. She tried to walk as quickly as possible, watching her step so as not to fall into a similar trap. Inside her, anxiety, pity, and resolve alternated. She didn't know if the Pallas's cat would survive, let alone be able to return to a normal life someday. But the main goal now was to give him a chance, because every living creature deserves a shot at salvation. Journey to a temporary safe haven. Soon the girl reached her field station, a small cabin equipped for researchers. Inside, it was warm, a stove was burning, and medical supplies and a first aid kit, which she always kept on hand, lay on the table. She placed the palace's cat on a makeshift bedding, gently unwrapped the towel, and saw the full extent of his condition. His paw was bleeding. The fur around it was sticky with blood and frozen with ice crystals. He was barely breathing. His eyes remained closed, although from time to time a soft hiss could be heard. The little creature was trying to defend himself, but had almost no strength left. The girl carefully washed the wound with warm water and treated it with antiseptic as best she could. Each time the preparation touched the raw flesh, the kitten raised his muzzle and let out a weak hiss, but soon fell back into a semi-conscious state. The researcher covered him with a soft cloth and placed him near the stove so that his body temperature would begin to recover. She was awestruck looking at this amazing animal, about which she had read so much. About his secrecy, how difficult it was even to glimpse him in the wild. And now she held in her hands a creature whose life depended on whether she could manage to help him. Memories of the Mother Palace's cat. Meanwhile, far away in the cliffs, the Mother Palace's cat had managed to escape the poachers, but she did not know what had happened to her kitten. She returned to the site of the trap after everything had quieted down, but found neither the trap nor her son. Bloodstains spread across the snow and she sniffed, trying to catch a scent, but the wind had scattered all traces. The mother's heart contracted in despair. In the animal world, it is not customary to grieve for long, because every day is a struggle for survival. But Palace's cats are also living beings with their own emotional world. She could not simply forget her little one. And yet, the surrounding reality demanded that she continue hunting, raise the remaining kittens, and be cautious. In the evenings, she listened quietly to the winds, hoping to hear a plaintive meow. But the steppe and mountains remained silent. For a moment, it seemed to her that she had caught a trace of human scent, but she did not understand what it could mean. And in these wanderings between her duty to the remaining children and the maternal instinct to help her lost kitten, her days passed. She did not know that her son had been lucky beyond measure. He had fallen into the hands not of a hunter, but of a kind-hearted person who would do everything possible to grant him salvation. The first days of rehabilitation. The kitten gradually began to recover in the warm room of the field station. The researcher, who mentally named him Snowy because of his fluffy white-gray fur, although Palace's cats usually have a more ashy or reddish-gray color, fed him broth diluted with special nutrients from a pipette to support his strength. Snowy offered almost no resistance, although from time to time his wild instinct still made itself known. A weak hiss or an attempt to nip with his teeth testified that the little creature still felt fear of humans. Every morning, the girl examined his paw, rebandaged it, and rejoiced, noticing that the bleeding had subsided and the swelling had begun to decrease. But her greatest fear concerned whether he would be able to walk and hunt properly again, because the bone tissue could have been damaged. It was important to give him time and not overload the injured paw. She called her veterinarian acquaintances to find out how to proceed in such a situation. Luckily, in the nearest town, a specialist agreed to come and examine the rare patient. The veterinarian's visit and hopes for recovery. When the vet, an elderly man with kind but slightly tired eyes, entered the station cabin, he immediately noticed the Palace's cat lying on the table. Removing his gloves, he approached the animal and carefully examined the injury. Gradually, a restrained smile appeared on the specialist's face. It seems that the damage is serious, but there's no fracture, or it's not critical. He'll live, although he'll need care. Relief washed over the girl. So, there was a chance that Snowy could return to the wild. The veterinarian gave injections, helped change the bandage, and gave recommendations on nutrition and general care. You need to limit movement, but not keep him in a completely confined space. Watch to make sure the wound doesn't fester. And don't forget, a palace's cat is a wild animal. You can't domesticate him so easily. The main thing is for him to recover and be able to continue his natural life. These words served as a reminder to the girl that despite all her love for animals, she had no right to deprive Snowy of his freedom. Encountering wildness. Several days passed. Snowy began to show signs of activity. He would crawl out of his shelter closer to the stove, sit for long periods, and gaze at the human with his large round eyes. At the same time, his defensive reactions intensified. If the girl approached too abruptly, he would start to growl, although he didn't have the strength to hiss loudly. Such behavior confirmed that his wild nature lived on. He had to survive independently, not seeking affection from people. At the same time, his paw was still not completely healed, but it no longer bled and looked dry with the wound beginning to close. The girl understood. To prevent the palace's cat from becoming attached to humans and losing his innate instincts, she needed to minimize direct contact. She tried to feed him in a way that made him feel as if he were hunting himself. She would place pieces of meat in different corners of the room, hiding them behind small obstacles. It was a kind of training so that the little creature would not forget basic hunting techniques. And yet, it was impossible to keep him indoors for long. Palace's cats are extremely sensitive to space. They need cliffs, step, the ability to hide, complete independence. The threat of poachers persists. While Snowy was recovering, nature reserve inspectors surveyed the area. They had received reports of poacher groups appearing. They found several traps, but scattered tracks indicated that their owners were acting covertly and could return at any moment. The researcher girl was worried, because if she released the palace's cat in the same place where he had been trapped, the risk of a repeat tragedy was too great. She wanted to wait until it became calmer, until the territory was cleared of traps, but time was passing, and Snowy was getting stronger. His heart yearned to return to his usual way of life. She observed how the kitten, already grown up during the treatment period, began to look out the window with interest, where the white plain stretched out. His eyes showed longing for freedom. He was no longer a semi-alive lump, gasping from pain. Now he was a real young palace's cat, stronger, with ruffled fur and resilient movements, although his paw still limped slightly. Return to the wild. A plan. One evening, the girl received news that several steppe areas had been officially cleared of poacher traps, and weather conditions had become milder. Spring was approaching and wildcats were entering a period of relative food abundance. At that moment, she firmly decided it was time to release Snowy. Of course, she understood that returning him to his usual territory was easier than searching for unknown places. But where he was born, poachers might still remain. In addition, no one knew where his family had disappeared. Most likely, his mother could have gone further into the mountains or changed dens. Thus, it was decided to take the palace's cat to a safer part of the reserve, where traces of other palace's cats had been noted, but where hunters rarely appeared. The girl prepared a transport cage to take him by car. The veterinarian agreed. Yes, he's almost recovered. It's better for him to return to nature before he gets too used to humans. A long journey off-road. The morning was cold but sunny. The girl carefully lured Snowy into the cage, placing a piece of fresh meat inside. He entered reluctantly, looking around suspiciously, but the instinct of hunger prevailed. As soon as the little creature was inside, she quietly closed the door and quickly secured the lock. The palace's cat hissed in fright, feeling trapped, but now everything had to happen quickly. The girl placed the cage in the back of her old SUV and set off. The road to the desired area went through rough terrain. The car jolted and Snowy growled and scratched at the cage walls, but the cage was sturdy, and the girl tried to drive carefully. Every bump was hard for the animal because he didn't understand what was happening and saw no sense in this commotion. However, as the sun rose higher, the landscape outside the windows became more and more magnificent. Mountain ranges, edged with snowcaps, gave way to rocky slopes and sprawling valleys. It was here, in these vast expanses, that the palace's cat was to find freedom. A new refuge. Finally, the girl stopped at the foot of the mountains, where, according to her information, there were several cozy gorges suitable for a den. The land here was rocky, covered with sparse vegetation, but it was precisely such an environment that suited Pallas's cats. An abundance of shelters, small burrows, and space for hunting. Getting out of the car, she placed the cage on the ground and paused briefly to make sure there were no people or large predators nearby. Everything looked quiet and peaceful. Only the wind swayed the stiff stems of grass, and the golden eagle circled on the horizon. The girl's heart pounded. She was eager to open the cage, but at the same time she felt a strange sadness. So much effort had been invested in saving this little creature, and now she had to part with him, realizing that she was unlikely to ever see him again. But this was exactly how this story should end. A wild animal would return to the wild. Snowy had to live, hunt, find a mate, do everything that was inherent in his nature. Farewell and a step into freedom. She slowly opened the cage door and stepped back a few paces. Snowy sat inside, ears pressed cautiously. He felt the wind, heard the rustle of leaves, and, most importantly, no longer saw the bars blocking his path. But fear of humans and the unfamiliar surroundings prevented him from jumping out immediately. The girl held her breath. Perhaps 2 minutes passed before the Pallas's cat tentatively extended a paw, cautiously feeling the ground. Taking the first step, he felt the familiar firmness of the soil under his pads. Then he suddenly leaped forward and turned sharply to the cage, as if expecting the door to slam shut or a human to pounce on him. But this did not happen. He stood, raising his thick tail, fluffing up his fur, looking around. The girl watched quietly, trying not to move. Another second, and Snowy darted off, slipped towards the rocks and disappeared behind a low ledge. Only a light swirl of dust and snow remained after him, and the echo of her heart beating. A few days later, adaptation. Time passed, and life went on. Snowy chose a small gorge where there were secluded caves and a decent hunting base. Pikas and ground squirrels were plentiful here. Of course, hunting was not easy for him because his paw still ached sometimes, and he had to learn to recalculate his movements. But instincts took over. He remembered his mother's lessons on how to lie in wait when prey approached, how important it was to anticipate the wind direction, how to strike with lightning speed and retreat to cover. Little by little, he began to fill his cunning, fluffy belly with small rodents, growing stronger day by day. In parallel, he was constantly on the alert, looking around, sniffing at foreign scents. In one place, he encountered tracks of another Pallas's cat and quickly realized that there could be rivals here, or perhaps potential allies. And predatory birds had not disappeared either. Hawks, eagles still patrolled above the cliffs, looking for someone to snatch to their nests. The harsh climate also left its mark. Cold winds did not allow him to relax. But Snowy gradually settled into the rhythm of wildlife, more and more successfully returning to what he was born to be. Longing for family. Sometimes in the evenings, when sunset painted the sky in purple hues, Snowy would sit on a rocky outcrop, exposing his thick fur to the gusts of wind. Images of his mother and siblings, with whom he had once shared a nest, surfaced in his memory. He remembered their scent, the sound of their paws on the stones, and the rustle of their fur when they huddled together, sheltering from the cold. He did not understand what had become of them. Perhaps they had moved to other areas, or, God forbid, fallen into other traps. But in his heart, though animalistic and rough, lived a quiet longing that he would no longer see his family. However, the world is wild and relentless. Animals do not spend their lives in sentimental memories. He had to live in the present. Today he needed to hunt, needed to protect his territory, needed stealth and endurance. In Snowy's soul, an understanding began to strengthen that he was an independent Pallas's cat. If he was destined to meet a relative someday, he would. Now all that was required was to listen to the call of blood and the instinct that pulled him forward along the slopes and crevices. New threats, new trials. Spring gave way to summer, and one day suspicious human tracks reappeared in the gorge. Perhaps these were geologists or climbers, but fear of people still lived in Snowy's memory. He smelled the scent and immediately became alert, trying to stay away. He spent several hours in hiding until the voices and noise subsided. His heart pounded at every flash of memories of the metal trap, of pain and helplessness. But this time, everything was different. He was not a wounded kitten. He had already grown up, become stronger, and learned to react instantly to danger. Nevertheless, the human threat remains unpredictable. Snowy could not know that the people visiting this place were not hunters, but simple nature lovers who would not harm an animal. His fear was justified because the moment of tragedy was etched too deeply in his consciousness. From now on, every unfamiliar human scent made him hide under rocks, growling and puffing up his tail. Fatal encounter or hunting ritual. One day, wandering along a mountain path, Snowy noticed a large marmot. It was peacefully chewing on sparse shoots, suspecting nothing. The palace's cat's heart began to beat. This could be a noble prey, large enough to provide food for a whole day or two. He slowly, silently began to stalk, completely merging with the grayish rocky surface. Step by step, he approached, focusing all his attention on the victim. Another second, and he pounced. The marmot noticed the movement too late. Sharp claws sank into its fur, and the marmot squeaked piercingly. For the palace's cat, this was a kind of ritual, restoring his natural strength. The taste of warm blood reminded him that he was a natural predator, created to fulfill this circle of life and death in the wild. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a palace's cat are always a test of his instincts and skills. Such hunting strengthened his muscles, restored the pride of a wild beast, and it also meant that neither the injury nor the pain he had once endured could deprive him of his essence as a hunter. Night on a ledge and a flash of lightning. The day came when the sky was overcast with storm clouds. A mountain thunderstorm is nature's spectacle. Lightning, thunderclaps, a downpour washing away paths in an instant. Snowy had already finished his prey and was looking for shelter. He found a small cave, but its opening was narrow. Huddling deep into the crevice, the palace's cat curled into a ball, trying not to betray himself with flashes of light. Thunderclaps echoed off the mountain walls, amplifying the roar many times over. The wind lashed rain against the stones, and the cold penetrated even into this shelter. In such moments, any animal understands. Nature is 100 times stronger than any threats created by man. But unlike a trap, natural elements are part of the natural order of things. Snowy pressed himself into the rocks, watching as streams of water flowed down the ledges, turning into raging streams. The elements raged until night fell. By that time, the lightning had gradually subsided, and the downpour had turned into a steady rain, washing away all traces of yesterday. And mother again. In a completely different area of the cliffs, many miles away, the mother palace's cat was leading her remaining kittens, who were now almost adults themselves. She had taught them to survive and was leading them to the edge of the territory where, according to her intuition, there were fewer risks. However, one of the young males, Snowy's brother, decided to go his own way. He rushed into the high cliffs, guided by his instinct to explore new territories. The mother did not object. Such is the natural process. But sometimes she would raise her muzzle to the wind and, feeling an unexpected echo of the past, the same scent that had emanated from her lost son, her heart would contract. She did not know if he was alive or dead, but in the quiet rustles of the wind, she imagined his voice. Weeks passed, seasons changed, but the persistent feeling of loss did not leave her. And yet, the world is wild and merciless, and she could not afford the luxury of long reflection. Hunting, sleep, protection from predators. A routine chain of actions where there is no place for sentimental searches for a lost cub. However, fate sometimes brings together those who are destined to meet again, even under the most incredible circumstances. Preparing for a harsh winter, Snowy settled into the new place. Summer ended, autumn came unexpectedly quickly. The wind became piercing, the grass dried up, rodents began to appear less frequently. The palace's cat felt the need to look for a more sheltered territory. He began to explore the gorge, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. Sometimes he found traces of other Pallas's cats, scents, markings, scratches on stones. Occasionally, he managed to spot a female Pallas's cat in the distance, but he did not yet dare to make direct contact, and she, sensing the presence of a stranger, preferred to hide. Winter here is merciless. Sheltering in stone voids is the only option. Pallas's cats do not know how to stock up on food like some rodents, so he had to move constantly, look for prey, and live on alert. But Snowy had one peculiarity. He had survived the experience of communicating with humans, because of which he became accustomed to reacting slightly differently to smells and sounds. And although he was still afraid, instinct told him sometimes a human might come not with evil, but trust was no longer possible. First encounter with a relative. One fine day, when the sun illuminated the snow caps of the mountains, Snowy descended slightly down the slope in search of food. There, he encountered another Pallas's cat, an adult male with a massive head and thick gray-pied fur. He was sitting near a stone and leisurely licking his paw. Seeing Snowy, the male became alert. His fur bristled. This was the elder's territory, and he was not going to share it with a young newcomer. Moving towards Snowy, he hissed menacingly, making it clear that the newcomer was not welcome here. Snowy, although grown up, had not yet reached full strength. Direct confrontation was risky. He retreated, pressing his ears, showing that he was not encroaching on alien territory. For a couple of moments, they sized each other up with their eyes. Two wild cats, each on their own guard boundary. Finally, the older male turned and left, considering that there was no threat. Snowy realized that he needed to look for another place where he could settle without provoking skirmishes until he was completely strong. Accidental joy. On the same day, wandering along winding paths, Snowy came across a food trail. Somewhere nearby, a rodent had left fresh droppings, but he did not have time to start hunting because he heard a barely distinguishable sound. A thin squeak, like the cry of another Pallas's cat. Hiding behind a stone, Snowy cautiously peeked out and saw a small kitten, clearly a Pallas's cat, trapped between stones. The Malish could not get out on his own yet. His fur looked mixed with sand and dust, and the plaintive squeak testified to despair. Memories flashed in Snowy's head. He himself had once been trapped. This Malish is not in a trap, but looks just as helpless. Instinct said, "This is not your own cub, it's a stranger, and in general, you are a male who is not obliged to care for offspring." But a response awoke in him. Memories of how he himself had once almost perished. He approached, pressed his ears, sniffed the kitten. The Malish looked at him with panic but tried to hiss, showing his ridiculous courage. Snowy pawed between the stones, lifting them and finally freed a passage. The Malish darted out and without hesitation ran away, disappearing into a crevice. Snowy watched after him, feeling an inexplicable warmth inside. Perhaps someone from his kind had escaped trouble, and he himself had played a small role in it. Second encounter with a human. Another couple of months passed, and life went on as usual. One bright sunny day, when the weather was unusually warm, Snowy went hunting at the foot of the mountains, where the snow had melted and the first spring shoots were breaking through. There he unexpectedly stumbled upon a human figure. It was the same researcher girl who had decided to re-examine the territory where she had released the Pallas's cat, to make sure there were no poachers here, and, if possible, to observe the life of local animals. Snowy's heart contracted. He immediately recognized the scent, the one that was associated with pain and salvation, fear and warmth. He lay down behind the stones, carefully watching the girl. She was walking in the direction of the ledge, measuring something on a GPS device and marking coordinates in a notebook. Snowy did not approach closer. He knew that humans were unpredictable. However, he was curious. He followed her at a distance, hiding among the rocks, listening intently as she calmly muttered something to herself. Brief contact. At some point, the girl stopped near a stone on which Snowy was sitting from above, imperceptibly pressed against the gray surface. She saw nothing, but felt someone's presence. Raising her head, she met the gaze of the palace's cat's large round eyes. He was close, just a couple of yards away. The girl gasped in surprise. She had never approached a wild palace's cat so closely before, except for the case when she had saved the kitten. He was larger than that Malush she had treated, but there was something familiar in his gaze, as if he remembered who she was. Snowy, fluffing up his tail, cautiously moved to the edge of the stone, but did not run away immediately. He felt that this particular woman did not bring him harm. However, wildness took over, and a moment later, he gracefully jumped down and disappeared behind boulders. The girl watched him go with bated breath, remembering the moment when she first saw the barely alive kitten in the trap. Could it be him, grown up and matured? Was it fate that had brought them together like this? She smiled, realizing that this was one of those wonderful mysteries of nature that you want to believe in. New life, new horizons. Time moved inexorably forward. Snowy had already reached the age when many palaces' cats have offspring. He wandered through different slopes, studied territories, found an abundance of tiny pikas, and sometimes even larger rodents. His paw, once injured, did not bother him too much. Everything had healed. Only a small scar reminded him of the ordeal. One spring night, he heard the call of a female palace's cat and followed the sound. The next chapter of his life was connected with the continuation of his kind and the exploration of a more spacious territory. Having matured, Snowy became a little more aggressive towards rivals, but also confident. He carefully marked his territory, although he tried to avoid open conflicts if possible. Thus went the natural cycle of life, and Snowy plunged deeper and deeper into his true essence, only occasionally remembering the cold touch of metal to his paw and the warm hands of the girl who had given him a second chance. Collision with the past. Years passed. Snowy had managed to become the father of several new generations of palace's cats. Once he thought he would never meet his relatives, but fate is cunning. In one place, not far from the familiar gorge, he heard the characteristic sounds of hissing and threats. Approaching, he saw two adult palace's cats disputing territory. One of them was older, and the other, judging by the scent, resembled something from the past. Snowy hid and began to watch, but soon the older palace's cat moved away, and the younger one limped slightly. Suddenly, the wind carried to Snowy barely perceptible aromas, from which his whiskers trembled. It was a scent similar to his own family. Perhaps it was his brother, who had also grown up and found his own life. But palace's cats do not live with nostalgia for family. Snowy simply realized that there were other palace's cats. Someone was living and thriving, despite all the hardships of the harsh climate. This understanding brought him a strange sense of calm. After all, if someone from his family had survived, it meant that the circle was still turning and their kind had not been interrupted. Human and nature, a fragile alliance. During this time, many changes had taken place in the region. Thanks to the efforts of ecologists and the nature reserve, raids against poachers became more frequent and punishments for illegal hunting became stricter. Some traps left after previous raids were removed, making the steppe and foothills safer for animals like palace's cats. People began to create programs to educate the local population, explaining that the palace's cat is a valuable species, carrying a unique natural heritage. The results were not instantaneous, but gradually the situation changed for the better. The researcher girl, still working at the nature reserve, sometimes remembered her special ward and wondered how his fate had turned out. She had tried many times to track palace's cat tracks, find specific markings, but it was almost impossible to identify specifically that one. And yet, a spark of hope lived within her that he was alive and well, hunting in the mountains, free and strong. Last encounter with a human. Once in early spring, Snowy stumbled upon another group of people. They were working with something near the rocks, talking loudly, and they smelled of something pungent that did not resemble the smell of either metal or burning. Snowy sensed danger and lay low. People were setting up strange objects. Perhaps these were movie cameras or equipment for nature observation. But Snowy did not know that these were harmless scientists who were studying the migration of pikas and other rodents. He felt only fear. What if this was a new type of trap? When the people left, he approached and carefully sniffed one of the objects left behind. The motion sensor device emitted a soft click, and the palace's cat recoiled in panic. But nothing happened. No trap, no pain. Realizing that there was no danger, he ran back to his safe crevices. Thus, a paradox was even more deeply ingrained in his consciousness. People can bring suffering, but they can also leave behind incomprehensible, harmless things. You still shouldn't trust them, but you need to be on the alert and, if possible, avoid meeting. Meeting of mother and son. In an amazing twist of events, it happened that the mother palace's cat, already very old and having extensive survival experience, found herself in the very gorge where Snowy now lived. She was looking for quieter places in her old age, because competition among palace's cats is fierce. At some point, their paths crossed. Snowy felt a scent that suddenly awakened distant memories in him. He became alert, not daring to come out of hiding. Finally, moving cautiously, he approached the place where the elderly female palace's cat was. Their eyes met. No one can claim that wild cats are able to recognize their loved ones after so many years. But they pick up nuances of scent, movement, energy. The mother palace's cat did not show aggression, although usually she would have chased away a strange adult male. They looked at each other for several moments, as if a silent conversation without words was taking place between them. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe a miracle of family reunion. In any case, no conflict arose. Snowy lowered his whiskers, expressing something like calmness. The older female only snorted softly and went her own way, not trying to engage in a skirmish. Thus, in the kingdom of palace's cats, a barely perceptible miracle sometimes happens. Past and present intersect at one point, acknowledging that every soul goes its own way, but we are all from the same place. Snowy's bride. Late in the spring, Snowy met a female to whom he felt a special attraction. She did not drive him away and allowed him to approach. Of course, they had no human courtship rituals, but in the language of palace's cats, simple mutual tolerance already means readiness to create a pair for reproduction. Soon, they settled in a secluded crevice where the female gave birth to 2 kittens. Snowy kept his distance at first, because male palace's cats do not always participate in raising offspring, and sometimes can even pose a threat. But instinct and past experience made him more sensitive. He did not seek to harm the kittens, but simply stayed nearby, guarding the territory. At the end of summer, the kittens were already running out of the den and learning to hunt, repeating all the techniques that their mother showed them. Snowy sometimes brought prey and left it at the entrance to their shelter, without engaging in direct family communication. This was the best proof of his role as a vigilant protector. Thus, he became part of a new cycle of life. Last gratitude. Time passed. Snowy grew old. Generations of palace's cats changed. When he reached several years of age, which is quite a lot for a wild representative of this species, he was already a strong but experienced male who had learned to emerge alive from many scrapes. People appeared in his life rarely, but each time they brought vague feelings of fear and curiosity. Once, when poacher raids had almost ceased, the researcher girl reappeared in the gorge. This time, she was walking around the cliffs not alone, but with a group of enthusiasts, checking camera traps and counting the number of local fauna. She glimpsed the silhouette of a fluffy beast in the distance. He stood on a stone and looked directly at the group of people. The distance was too great, but her heart told her this could be the very palace's cat she had once saved. She slightly raised her hand, as if greeting him. Snowy, sensing the company of people, could have fled, but for some reason lingered for a moment longer than usual. And in that moment, it seemed to her that he recognized her. Maybe it was just imagination, but deep down, she felt gratitude that he was alive. Snowy finally jumped off the stone and dissolved into the boundless steppe, carrying in his heart the strength and pride of a wild beast. This was their last visible intersection, human and palace's cat, whose fates had intertwined for only a brief moment, to remind the world of the power of compassion and that nature can be both generous and harsh at the same time. Happy freedom! Although many stories about the lives of wild animals end tragically, fate made an exception for Snowy. He survived after a terrible trap, found his place in the mountains, created offspring, learned a lot, and even met the human who gave him a second chance. This long chain of events reflected the essence of the relationship between nature and people. Cruelty is replaced by mercy, pain, by salvation, loneliness, by hope. No one knows how many more years Snowy will live, but he has already left his mark among the rocks and steppes, in the hearts and memory of those who saw him. It may seem that this story is just a coincidence, but every time a person helps a wounded animal, the world becomes a little brighter. Pallas's cats are ancient inhabitants of our world, and if at least one of them gets a chance at life, it is a sign that we have not lost everything yet. For Snowy, the return to freedom became a happy ending. He did not return to captivity, did not become an exhibit in a zoo, but remained part of the boundless expanse of his native land. And every time the wind runs through the rocks, somewhere there, in the shade of the stones, among the tough grasses and echoes of mountain storms, you can see his silhouette, magical, graceful, full of indomitable spirit. Epilogue. This is a tale of a small, fluffy warrior, made cautious by nature and vulnerable by humans. But in the end, he found not only wounds, but also healing. Not only fear, but also freedom. Snowy's story is not just fiction. It reflects the fates of many animals who daily face human cruelty and the elements. And may not everyone be so lucky, but may this heartbreaking story remind us that every living creature deserves a chance at life and a worthy destiny. And somewhere in the distant mountains of Central Asia, in the endless steppe, a Pallas's cat, nicknamed Snowy, runs towards the wind, happy and free, confirming that good can overcome even the most insidious trap.